So, hello and welcome to SBOM Europe's update. This is the day where the CRA clock starts ticking, and we're going to have a short update webinar to talk about the CRA and have an open discussion at the end. The countdown have begun. It's formally, if you just count all the days, 1,094 days until all products needs to be CE marked. And this is really the focus of the CRA. We had a discussion previously, Anthony and I, and by doing some magic calculations, we ended up with around 700 days of work, unless you work over weekends and holidays. We hope that the legislation won't mean that developers have to work full time and not have holidays until the CRA is effective. I am Ole Johansson. I'm a consultant up in Sollentuna, Sweden, working with cybersecurity, real-time communication with SIP and WebRTC and other things since many years. And my co-host Anthony here as well. Who are you, Anthony?
Hello, welcome everyone. Yes, I'm Anthony Howson. I'm from Manchester in the UK. I'm a consultant looking at software risk, particularly within the software supply chain, and helping organisations deliver a secure software development lifecycle. All very relevant for what we're going to talk about today.
Great. And we are SBOM Europe. We're going to talk a little bit more about what we do, but we run webinars, both training webinars, short ones, and live meetings. We have a meeting coming up in the end of December here, or I would say in the middle of December before Christmas, which is very interesting. It's a lawyer, Johanna, and we're going to talk more about that later. So the agenda for today's seminar is a brief introduction to the CRA first, and then we're going to talk about our trainings. And after that, we're going to have an open discussion. Is this good or bad? Where will this go? How will this affect open source? Please join us in the discussion. But let's go with the CRA. Do you want to start, Anthony?
Yeah, let's start with probably the major thing is CRA is all about the onus is on the manufacturer of the digital product, and they take responsibility for managing the security risks and making sure everything is secure by default. So none of the cases where you ship a product and you ask the end user to set a password, and if they don't set a password, then their device may be exposed. We're looking at very much the manufacturer has to ensure that his product is secure out of the box, so to speak, and not rely on the end user to harden it.
I mean, this is at the heart of the CRA, to protect the citizens, the customers, and protect society. In a text that came before they actually proposed some legislation, they say that the cost for society is way too high, and the solution is to push the burden over to shift the responsibility to the manufacturer, which is an interesting move, but we also see that in other parts of the world. One other part is a mandatory free security update during the product's lifetime. All customers have the right to get security updates, and this doesn't mean that we get one update every second year. This means regular updates that based on the vulnerability flow, both in your own code and in third-party code that you use. And manufacturers have a huge responsibility to inform the users, the customers, the owners about vulnerabilities in the products and the need for update, especially if the vulnerability is exploited. Then the manufacturer have 24 hours to report to the country authority that something is going on, and then the reporting continues while the manufacturer fixes the problem.
I think there's obviously different ways that this can be delivered or met. You know, you can see things where we probably already see things like our browsers are automatically getting security updates, you know, every couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's the model that people will choose or whether it's a case of um, the device goes and calls home and pulls things down from their website, I don't know. There'll be different mechanisms, but it clearly to make sure that your product is capable of being updated. It's not locked from ever being updated in the future.
Yeah, and the CRA text strongly urges manufacturers to have automatic updates turned on, allowing the customer to turn it off, of course. But this really affects large parts, especially OT products, industrial IT, where updates haven't been as frequent as with internet connected systems in other parts. So this is a big change for many manufacturers. Okay. At the heart of the CRA, you have the CE certification. The CE certification today applies mostly to hardware and in some cases, medical software and other businesses. But now it applies to all software. And the meaning here is if you CE mark your software, you have followed the CRA or horizontal standards that applies, and you take care of the cybersecurity, you protect your customers.
And this is quite a big change. Obviously, certainly for certain products, that's going to mean that you're going to need that certification probably from a third party. For some products, I think you'll be able to self assert. I think, from my understanding, obviously that may change as the guidelines come out. But it's a big sort of it's showing a threshold in terms of security. As I said, if you've got CE marked, you've met minimum set of criteria. At the moment, you've got no criteria, so it's a good baseline. And we think we've seen the benefits from having hardware all CE marks. From safety perspective, it's been a big step forward.
Yeah, and as you say, like with the current CE mark, 90% of the products seems to be falling in the category of self-certification. The rest may have third-party certification, and one critical category will have a special EU certification. But in all cases, the manufacturer is responsible. But the question here is, who's responsible if there is no local manufacturer? Well, the law clearly states that the organization that placed the product on the market, the organization that sells it into the market across the borders, will be responsible. So importers and distributors will be liable very much in the same way. So they need to have assurance from the manufacturers outside of the EU that they take responsibility that the product is in fact CE compliant.
And I think this one has the opportunity for actually being quite invasive, because obviously that's quite an onerous responsibility for the importer distributor. And will this lead to fewer products being made available initially? I don't know. This is going to be interesting thing to watch the market.
Absolutely. Here in Sweden, we have a huge set of products sold on mail order directly from Asia that will be affected directly, where the Chinese will be affected, the manufacturers or the distributors there, the big portals. But there are also some cases where manufacturers have started copying mobile app stores. For instance, in my NAS, I can import and add a lot of cool applications in a kind of an app store for the NAS. The manufacturer of the NAS will be responsible for those products, regardless if they charge money or if it's for free. It will be a responsibility. And I see when I run Docker Desktop that they have added a little app store within Docker where I can add third-party plugins. All of these situations will become very interesting.
Mhm.
Antti.
Okay, so this is the one that gets me really interested, because this is really means that you've got to understand where your software comes from, and the
And
software
how it's built.
and how it's being built, where it's come from. So this is all about the risk, managing the risk. So most products are going to be using open source components to some extent. I think we know 90+% of all products have got some open source in them. Some of the products are nearly fully open source. So understanding that supply chain, where that comes from, is mandatory. So that means it's no longer understanding how you're using it, but where does it come from? Have you obtained it from a reliable source? Can you trace its provenance? So there's a huge amount of investigation in some cases. If you haven't got this information readily available, you're going to have to start mining it. And this is where things like software bill of materials come in, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit about. So understanding, can you identify all the components? Can you identify the versions of all the components? And that's going to help you understand, have you got a vulnerability that you need to report? So this is really quite a big, could be quite a big demand on product manufacturers to actually build this and maintain this, because it's not a one-off. It needs to be continually, what I call, curated, looked after.
Oh, yeah.
And you need to look after it from, cradle to grave. So from the initial time you start building your product to the time your product then goes out of support, and you need to be looking after this, and it needs to be well documented, and it needs to be available so that people can inspect it. So this is quite a big understanding, and it's quite, don't understand it's just for people you have immediate relationships with. It's all the way down, the second, the third, fourth, fifth parties. It's quite a lot.
And it's important that the easy part to talk to, and I keep doing that as well, is the third-party products. But you really have to look in how you build your own delivery, how you build your containers, how you build your cloud services, how you build your binaries for your embedded systems and other things, mobile apps. You can't just say, oh, it was Bill who built this on his laptop back home. You have to have a full traceable chain. And exactly as you said, Anthony, you have to know exactly which tools you use to build, test, and which tools, third-party components you actually integrated with at build time. So at the station of the build system and security, we have to remember SolarWind type style of attacks, where you inject bad software in your CI/CD tool chain.
And I think
tool chain has to be verified.
Yeah, and I think also we recognise how deep you may have to go to, because we saw that 3 years ago now with Log4Shell, where people did not know they were using the Java logging library, because it was, although their product wasn't directly using it, components that they were using were, and it's actually understanding that full extent, because that's providing your full attack surface. So.
Which leads us to this, right? And I know you have a lot to say here, so please, Anthony.
This is all about the risk and the impact that your product could lead to your consumers. So what you have to understand is, if you have a device that's internet facing, that's a very different risk to something that's maybe in an internal organization behind a firewall, maybe a home device that's behind your home router. You need to understand how the product is going to be used. Your product may be used in multiple scenarios, so obviously that may make it more complicated. But you really need to look at what that risk is, and that's probably going to help you understand how you prioritize your addressing the risks, because you can't necessarily say you treat every product in the same way. It's going to be dependent on the way the product is going to be used. But this really is really important that you keep on top of that, because risks will change. As we all know, the threat landscape outside is continually changing as people get, innovative ways of attacking products. You need to be able to keep on top of those. So be aware, and also don't think it's just all about getting nice new features. You need to look after the less exciting things of keeping your product secure. But that's ultimately where we need to get to.
So there are a couple of more things here. The risk assessment has to be updated for every release and be part of your documentation. And you're not allowed, and this says clearly, is said clearly in the text, that you're not allowed to downplay the risk. The authorities will monitor that, especially if something happens. If you have a really bad and not managed risk assessment for your product, then you will have problems. But it's important that this is really based on the risk assessment. Yes.
So yeah, and I was going to say, how you do that risk assessment, I think we will expect there will be guidelines provided to help people do that assessment. I mean, there's multiple ways of doing risk assessments for security. I'm expecting that the EU will come out with some recommended approaches of how to do that assessment. I certainly hope they do, because it would be really good if we can get people to be doing it in a consistent manner.
There will be implementation guides and others coming out, but it will take time. Open source has been discussing this quite a lot. In the original proposal from the Commission, there was a lot of bad text and misunderstandings. The lawmaker made it very clear that they had no idea what they were trying to make laws about. But in the final proposal, the law that actually is in action today, we have a much clearer text, much better. So open source is really excluded, but there are gray areas. If you run a commercial company, release your part of your product as open source, then you may be under the commercial clause and not under the exception. But this will be cleared out. There are a lot of organizations here that have joined forces, both under Linux Foundation and under Eclipse, to work together with the Commission to get guidelines and get clarity in what really applies and where the difference between commercial software and open source software and exceptions are. So there has been a lot of good work, and there will be much more coming up.
I think the open source steward, I think, is a interesting approach. I mean, one of the things that the CRA really is looking for is there's quite a bit more process and rigor in the development. That many open source projects, the fun is actually writing software that others can benefit from. Here we're talking about, well, you need to have a little bit more process associated with, and the open source steward is sort of providing that comforting blanket to try and help many open source projects come together and you give them that sort of assurance. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. People like the Eclipse Foundation being quite a big player in this space.
There will also be some sort of security attestation for open source projects, but being exempt from many of the requirements in the law doesn't mean that they're free. Open source has to work with security in focus, and there will be changes. That's quite clear, but I think it's for good. Maintaining an SBOM is mandatory by the law. It's not mandatory to deliver it to customers, but there's a lot of text about the benefits of SBOMs for customers. but it should not be required, says the law. I think many customers will, especially in the enterprise sector, will require SBOMs. But you have to really map your software, all the third-party components, both hardware, software, firmware, and make sure that you have control over what you use and be able to test this for vulnerability, license compliance, and other things. So you have to do due diligence on all your third parties, both open source and commercial, and make sure you're aware of where they are in the process.
So I think it's quite important. SBOM is software bill of materials. One of the challenges we have is making sure the SBOM is as complete and accurate as possible. I think, you know, SBOMs have been around for quite some time now. There's quite a lot of practical experience about creating SBOMs. And they're starting to emerge, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, about some of the best practices. But actually, you know, this is going to be quite, you know, hopefully the tooling space will sort of step up the mark and actually make SBOMs better. So, you know, because there's going to be, you know, a larger market now for creating SBOMs. I think making SBOMs, sharing SBOMs is obviously a concern for some people, but so the CRA does not mandate that gets shared or shared publicly rather. It will probably be shared on demand, and that's probably no different to, say, you know, like a contractual obligation you may already have as a commercial organisation. So there's nothing new about sort of sharing your design. It's just maybe making sure it's available in a particular structure, the right level of information. And we've, you know, there's some good practice over the last few years about what good looks like now, and hopefully that will mature, or, you know.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting that the text in the CRA says that you need to maintain an SBOM at least at the top level components. But on the other hand, the text is very clear that as a manufacturer, you're responsible for everything within your product. So you really have to have, at least internally, a full qualified SBOM. And what that is something that both Anthony and I spend a lot of time working on in different forums within OWASP, Cyclone DX, SPDX, and other forums. So that's something we're going to talk more about, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that the focus, I hope, it will be on the content of the document of the SBOM, as distinct from the format, which is Cyclone DX or SPDX. I think it's important we actually ensure that the information that is presented is accurate. I'm just reading something this morning to set, you know, of someone's view about that, and, you know, how currently there's, you know, a lot of inaccurate information being recorded. So, you know, we need to make sure that the people can actually validate, you know, the data and make sure it is, you know, represents their product accurately.
Yeah. So while speaking about the CRA in various groups and settings, a lot of foreigners says, "Oh, I'm happy this doesn't apply to me because I'm outside the EU." Well, if they sell anything to the EU, they have to follow the regulation within the EU. That means that all products sold here, regardless of where the manufacturer is, has to be CE marked and CRA compatible. And this makes CRA a worldwide regulation, really, and it's a very interesting effect. I mean, I know some here are outside the union, right, Anthony?
Yes, but we still talk to the union. But yeah, I think this is quite important. You know, the EU is a large market for many people for digital products. So there's plenty of people who want to sell to the EU. I think you can look at this, you know, the other way is this: the EU trying to define a global standard as well. So, you know, it's going to take time, but clearly, I think the time for discussing about how do we make products secure, I think is over now. there's a clear direction of travel that governments want to ensure that products are secure from cyber secure for the benefit of their citizens. And I think that's a very clear message that
Yep.
we're seeing globally. So this is, it's in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, in the US, there's a discussion about something called CyberMark for IoT products, which is fairly similar. And I know there have been discussions about how to make these regulations compliant with each other. So if you have CE in one market, you'll get CyberMark on the other. And CyberMark in the US would mean that you're compliant with CE. But we'll see. That probably takes a lot of bilateral meetings and fancy dinners until we have seen the results of that.
Yeah. And I think if you're a manufacturer, you want to have a few good standards rather than lots of very diverse standards. So I'm hoping that there will be some convergence of the standards over time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have room for a few questions. You can either write in the chat or turn on your microphone. We're gonna allow for a few questions before we continue with our agenda.
There's a question in the chat, Ollie. Have you seen that?
Yeah, should we approach that? This is Hans asking if the expected usage depends on which apps you install on your product. That's a very interesting question. I don't think so. I think operating systems have to expect all kinds of apps that they support. But yeah, this is very interesting. We had a discussion earlier about me and a friend about the product liability directive, which goes hand in hand with the CRA. And expected usage for some products like the Linux kernel is really, really hard to define because it's used in everything from mobile phones to lunar rovers and medical applications and other things. So expected usage, there will be a lot of discussions about that.
Yeah, and I think this is the difference between I often, when I'm talking to people about a single-use computer, I use the thing like a smoke alarm we all have in our houses. There's some technology there, but don't think your smoke alarm is going to be able to play a game because it's a very fixed. It's got one function. Whereas if you've got something that's quite generic, like a gaming machine, then it's how do you ensure your bounding? So it's going to be quite interesting to see how they handle the generic products against the fixed products.
Yeah, and products you think are single use are not really built that way because of costs, I would say. It's so simple to have a generic processor, a generic operating system. I don't know if it was fake or true, but I laughed yesterday when I saw a headline about a denial of service attack that came from digital toothbrushes all around the world. But it wouldn't surprise me if it was true, really. Do you have any other question before we continue? In the chat or if you turn on your microphone. Oh, wow, Anthony, we were crystal clear.
Oh, no, we've got another one from Hans.
Oh.
Yes, Hans, yes, I think when we talk about SBOMs, we're talking about the life cycle of an SBOM. I think creating an SBOM, it shouldn't be that hard, but from what I see, there's still a lot of divergence, I say divergence in the level of information that products will put in it. Some are very, do a very, very minimum. Some are a little bit more enriched. It's going to take time. I think you're also right about something called VEX, which is the Vulnerability Exploitation Exchange. That will become quite an important document. I think one of the things that the CRA is trying to deliver is, it said, vulnerable free. I think that's probably, hopefully, will get well defined, because I don't think anyone will say that they can purely assert that their software has no vulnerabilities or defects.
It's a nice dream.
It's a nice dream, yes. But actually, so VEX is going to be one of those ways of actually product manufacturers can see a vulnerability in a third-party product, and they can report to say, yes, we've looked at it, we've asserted that that vulnerability cannot occur in our product for various reasons, like we've not built it, it only applies in a particular processor architecture or a particular configuration, or we're not using that function. But at least it's then very clear, so you can then say, yeah, we're free from that issue. So that, you're right, VEX could be quite a big burden for some people.
Absolutely, especially since VEX involves a lot of both, I would say, non-parsable text and a lot of opinions. If I'm a manufacturer and I get VEX files every week from my upstream supplier saying that, oh, we're not affected, we're not affected, we're not affected. In the end, I won't trust this anymore. And that's something I have to handle manually, and handling things manually will cost a lot of money.
Johannes, yes, okay, transient dependencies. I think this is what Oli sort of hinted at, that, where the CRA in one point says you need to depend the direct dependencies, but then on the other hand, that you're responsible for the full content of your product, which will include the transient dependencies. So then the discussion has been about, well, if you find there's a defect in a transient dependency, you're meant to go upstream and potentially work with that provider to get the product fixed, which is easier said than done in some cases, because some open source projects are only done by an individual, and he might have decided he's had enough of looking after his products and he goes away and does something else. So this is going to be quite an interesting thing. What happens to out-of-date components? But that's where you need to be as a manufacturer, monitoring the health of the product. Is the product being maintained? Is it not? And if it's not, then maybe you may have to redesign your product to use a different solution, or a different component rather.
But this is also an area, if you take a table and put in a lot of people interested in SBOM and vulnerability management around it, and you start asking questions about this. I read a lot of science fiction, so it's turtles all the way down. And when you're all the way down, you'll find more turtles. For instance, if you have a dependency on a Python program, you have a dependency upon the Python compiler. While Python, as well as Node.js and others, they include a lot of interesting stuff in itself and third-party dependencies. So if you have Python as a component, is that one component, or should it actually include the whole family tree of Python? If you're running on a firmware, hardware with a lot of different firmware, do you want to include all the firmware on your hardware board? You can spend hours and a lot of good wine discussing this with SBOM interested people. So there's no clear answer here on how deep you want to go and how many turtles you want to kill in the process.
Well, one of the things that I think, if you look at industry, I think a lot of people have said a lot of the exploits in products often come from those transient dependencies. I think about 85% of vulnerabilities are in the transient dependencies. So I would be slightly, I recognize it's quite potentially quite a lot of work, but actually this is where I think you need to think about understanding those dependencies to protect you and your customers.
Absolutely. Let's move on. This is an interesting discussion. We're doing things in SBOM Europe behind the scenes. We're gearing up. We've been so far running mostly the live shows, and we're going to record a few of the academies before Christmas. And this is what we call an SBOM update. It's not an interview or a dialogue with fireside chat with one person. We're talking about new things that happens. But today we're adding a new area where both Anthony and I have been working for a while, but we're making it into a shared product set called SBOM Trainings. So we're launching a training model where we have different types of trainings for different groups. So in the base, we have what we call the awareness part, where we're going to run short seminars on various topics, on introduction level, to get everyone in a company, a development company aboard, and to understand the Cyber Resilience Act from procurement and legal all the way to development, testing, and release management. We also have a few, and we're developing a few new ones, workshops that are half-day workshops, where we go much deeper, and optionally we can add labs, practical things to it. And we're also ready to do coaching on expert level. To give you a few examples, we call the awareness part for 101s. So we have already material for open source vulnerability management introduction, CRA, software bill of materials, and due diligence. And we're likely going to add a few more. On the workshop side, we already have the CRA workshop, SBOM, vulnerability management, and risk management. And you'll see this showing up. We have a few of them on our website now. We're good at doing trainings. We're not that good at creating cool websites, but we're working on it. So you'll see much more coming up in the coming days. But if you have questions, you can contact us really already. We run this training preferably on site with your teams to have interactions and be able to, in a good climate, have questions and answers and really sort things out and make sure you're all on the same level. But we can run them virtually like this as well, but we feel it's not really the same. But it depends on the size of the company and the amount of people you want to have involved. So you can make it a full day package and have a management roundtable attached as well. We're open for ideas and discussions on this. Anthony, do you want to add something here on the trainings?
I think there's, you can only myself have been sort of promoting SBOMs and the practicalities of SBOMs for a while now. So I think we've got good practical experience that we want to share and help organisations make that step change. Yes, I think interaction is going to be key for any of the training you do. Delivering online is never quite the same. We need to see and we can react a lot more. We can then dwell on the certain parts of the topics which are, stimulate discussion amongst your teams. So, we'd encourage you to try and do it on site if you can. But we feel, we recognise that, hybrid, if you've got a very distributed team, maybe an online distribution will have to be, would be required. Make inquiries. We're ready to start delivering this first quarter next year, we look forward to people asking us for proposals.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that said, we're moving over to the next part of the agenda, an open discussion. What do you think about the Cyber Resilience Act, and what questions do you have? Please ask in the chat or turn on your video and microphone, and let's go and see what we can sort out.
I guess now's the time for me to ask, what on earth is the CRA?
You came in late, Per-Erik.
Oh, yes, I did.
We did go through a few issues beforehand, but the interesting part here is if you want a short and brief version, it's about protecting the society, protecting the customers from cyber crime, really. I would say I usually start with that the EU has seen the cost of all the issues, ransomware, malware, everything that has happened during the last couple of years, and it's not shrinking. So what they see is that while the CRA and everything about it will raise the cost of producing software, the cost for society will go down. And that I think that's the core of why they are producing legislations like this, is to protect society. And then after that, the rest of the answer is 200 slides with technical things and legal things.
And I think, you know, we've already seen this with things like GDPR and how, you know, to protect data, you know, to make sure the data is looked after. This is sort of the next thing. This is looking out to look at products, digital products.
Yeah.
So
and all this legislation in the big cybersecurity field of the EU, they kind of fit together. The GDPR is referred to in the CRA. In the NIS2 Act directive, there is pointers to Cyber Resilience Act, and the PLD kind of covers it all. So they fit together and work together. So this is not the only thing that is interesting is there's something called the radio directive, radio equipment directive, that has came out with a delegated act that will apply from next year already, which is very, very similar to the Cyber Resilience Act. So equipment with radio and software and internet or network connectivity will have to work much faster than the 1,084 days. But that legislation will likely in part be replaced by the CRA when it comes into full action.
I think it's important to say that the CRA is almost like the sort of the lowest baseline. You know, we're going to see probably other standards which are going to build on that for particular sectors. So I think you've already got things like that in financial things with things like DORA, which is coming in next month.
Yep.
So this is sort of just building that framework that, you know, that everybody needs to conform to, and then sector-specific things can be built on top.
Absolutely. Hans, you had a question.
Yeah, a little bit curious about your initiative, the Transparency Exchange API. I think this issue you are addressing is not targeting one company. You have to target all the company, because all company use open source. I mean, this stack of turtles, it never ends. So I think you must involve everyone. And we're talking about the defense industry. I mean, civil actors, you have tier one in the supply chain, but for critical component used in warfare, you have to follow the supply chain and stay within the union or your allied countries. So that, I mean, I'm talking with companies building products, and the hardware is a little bit like the Linux kernel. So it's very expensive, and we had to find many markets to sell the generic components.
Yeah.
So
what Hans is referring to is an OWASP initiative I'm leading called Project Koala, or the Transparency Exchange API, T, where we create an API for automation of the exchange of software bill of materials, hardware bill of materials, attestations, all kinds of data, including VEX, of course, so that a customer, either a manufacturer with upstream vendors or the end customer, may automatically get all the updates from their vendors. And this is something that's needed to have a scalability, but also agility in the supply chain work.
But I think, you know, you've also got to recognize the software industry is a global industry, not there's no one country. Okay, certain countries dominate, but or may appear to dominate, but you know, most software is written by developers spread across the world. So yeah, the Linux kernel does not live in the US or France or wherever. So, you know, we just have to recognize that that's the thing. Ultimately, this is how a product is assembled. And it's the assembled integrated product, which is really where the CRA is looking at that delivered product.
Yeah.
Just want to check an ID. I mean, if you offer classes and you also driving this TIA API, how about offering training and then put a sign on a company? It's TIA certified. And then you go to the next workshop, they can connect and start sharing, exchanging SBOM, and then you get a leverage effect.
That's absolutely interesting. We'll start with running interoperability tests at UVASP AppSec in Barcelona in May. And you're very welcome to participate with your implementation. Anthony and I will spend Christmas writing our own implementation to start with. And we'll see. You'll find on the GitHub repository for SBOM Europe that there are very tiny pieces of test code because this API is still under development. But we'll see what happens. But let's move on now and see where we are. Thank you for the questions. So we have a few coming events we would like to inform you about. The next SBOM Lives webinar is with Johanna Parika Altenstedt, a lawyer and cybersecurity consultant that have very interesting and very fresh views on how legal can be involved in the risk assessment and the software development process. We talk a lot in the industry about shifting cybersecurity left, but Johanna adds that while legal needs to move left as well and be a part of product development from the first initial whiteboard designs on all the way up to release and customer delivery. Our next webinar in SBOM Live series, number 4, is scheduled to January 16. We'll soon come up with a registration for it. This will be about trusting the software supply chain, and we have a very, very interesting guest who's been extremely active in the software supply chain community, I would say, both in UVASP and OpenSSF. And we're going to tell you more about who he is and what happens very soon. Another big event that we're preparing for, both Anthony and I, is FOSDEM. This is the biggest open source conference, I would say, in the world. So many people from all across come to this free conference. You just have to pay for the beer and drinks and food, but the conference has no cost. They ask you politely to buy a t-shirt to help them with some of the cost to cover the conference. But there are a couple of very interesting sessions here. You have an SBOM development track. You have one or two tracks about the policy landscape in the EU. And you have a security dev room where we're going to talk software supply chain security. But in addition to FOSDEM, which is 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, there's an open source week with events in front of and after FOSDEM. So you can find a lot of interesting events on opensourceweek.eu.
And there's just after the FOSDEM. So yeah, so the FOSDEM is sort of the weekend. A lot of stuff in Brussels before, and then on the Tuesday and Wednesday afterwards, there is the State of OpenCon in London, which again is a big open source. It's a mixture of technical and non-technical talks, but it's about the world of open source, and they get some excellent keynote speakers as well. So that the agenda for that hasn't been announced yet. Hopefully some of that might start coming out next week, so we may be able to promote it at the end of our live webinar next week.
Okay. We're looking forward to this. And as I said, after FOSDEM in May, UVASP is running AppSec Barcelona at the end of May. AppSec Global EU, I think, is the formal name. That will be a very interesting conference with a lot of SBOM talk, I hope. And with that, we want to say thank you. This became a longer seminar than we expected, but we always have a lot to say, haven't we, Anthony?
Yes.
Yes. Please follow us on LinkedIn or on YouTube channel. You can also chat with us there or find ourselves on various forums all over the place. So thank you for participating and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.